The person you love got deeply emotional last night. They're saying, "Please watch this now." My beloved child. The person you love reached an emotional breaking point last night, and what happened in those quiet hours is something they never expected you to know. They tried to hold themselves together. They tried to distract their mind, put their phone down, and convince themselves that whatever they were feeling would disappear by morning. But it didn't. Your name kept returning to them. Your face. Your voice. One particular memory they thought they had buried suddenly came rushing back, and that was when everything changed. Their eyes filled with tears because they finally understood something about you that they had refused to admit for far too long. And now, inside their heart, one sentence keeps repeating, "Please watch this now." But why tonight? Why does it suddenly feel so urgent? Don't skip, because the reason behind those emotions goes much deeper than simply missing you. Something happened when they looked back at the last meaningful moment between you. They remembered something you said, perhaps something simple that seemed unimportant at the time, and suddenly they heard those words differently. They realized there was emotion behind your silence that they completely misunderstood. For months, they may have told themselves that you stopped caring, that you were moving forward, or that whatever existed between you had simply faded. Last night, that story began falling apart. They started questioning their own choices. What if they pushed away someone who was actually waiting for honesty? What if your distance wasn't rejection at all, but protection after being disappointed too many times? That thought hit them hard. They picked up their phone more than once. They opened something connected to you, stared at it, closed it, then returned again. They wanted to reach out, but there was one truth they still couldn't bring themselves to type. And this is where last night became different from every other night they have spent thinking about you. Their emotions weren't coming only from regret. There was fear underneath them. A very specific fear. That something may be changing in your life, and they may be running out of time to tell you what they have been hiding. Suddenly, staying silent no longer felt safe. It felt like a decision that could cost them the connection forever. So they began forming the words they wished they had said earlier. Not a casual message. Not another vague attempt to get your attention. Something deeply personal. Something that could completely change the way you understand their behavior toward you. But just as they were ready to finally express it, they stopped, because there is one detail about their silence that you still don't know, and once that detail comes forward, you may finally understand why they're desperately saying, "Please watch this now." What stopped them wasn't uncertainty about their feelings. It was the memory of a decision they made when they believed they were protecting both of you. They had convinced themselves that keeping their distance would prevent more pain, but last night they finally saw what that silence had actually created. Every unanswered moment. Every time you wondered why they suddenly became distant. Every opportunity when they could have explained themselves but chose fear instead. And then came the realization that shook them. You may have interpreted their silence as proof that you meant nothing to them, when the truth was almost the exact opposite. They cared so deeply that they became afraid of what would happen if they admitted it. But there was another reason they pulled away, and this is the part they have been struggling to reveal. They were carrying information they didn't know how to explain without changing everything between you. It wasn't some dramatic secret designed to hurt you. It was something personal, something connected to a choice they made while they were confused, overwhelmed, and convinced they needed more time. But time didn't make the feelings disappear. It made them louder. Last night, they finally admitted to themselves that waiting had become another form of running away. That is why their emotions became impossible to control. They imagined you hearing the truth from someone else, or worse, moving forward without ever knowing what was really happening inside them. Stay till the end, because what they decided next wasn't impulsive. They began preparing themselves to say something they had rehearsed silently many times, but had never been brave enough to place in front of you. Then something unexpected happened. They noticed a small reminder of you, something connected to a conversation, a photograph, a message, or a memory, and instead of avoiding it, they stayed with it. That moment forced them to face the question they had been escaping: if I never tell them, can I live with that? Their answer came almost immediately. No. That was when their fear changed direction. They were no longer most afraid of your reaction, they became more afraid of losing the chance to be truthful with you at all. So they made a quiet decision last night. They would stop hiding behind silence. They would let you understand why they disappeared emotionally, why they kept returning in subtle ways, and why they could never completely let you go. But before they can say the words you've been waiting to hear, there is one confession they believe you deserve first, and it explains what really happened the moment they realized they were falling deeply for you. The moment they realized they were falling deeply for you wasn't romantic in the way you might imagine. There was no perfect setting, no carefully planned confession. It happened during an ordinary moment when you showed them a side of yourself they weren't prepared for. Your patience, your honesty, the way you seemed to understand what they weren't saying. Something inside them shifted. Instead of feeling excited, they became frightened. Because suddenly you weren't someone they could easily forget if things went wrong. You had become someone capable of reaching the places they kept guarded. That was the beginning of their distance. They thought stepping back would weaken the connection, but every day away from you proved the opposite. And last night, they finally admitted the painful truth: they didn't pull away because they felt too little. They pulled away because they felt far more than they knew how to handle. But there's another detail they've never explained. During that period of distance, they kept checking for signs that you still cared. A message. A small change. Anything that might tell them the door wasn't completely closed. Yet whenever they considered approaching you, the same question stopped them. What if I waited too long? That question became unbearable last night. They imagined finally speaking honestly and discovering that your heart had already moved somewhere they could no longer reach. For the first time, they understood what their silence might have cost them. Something huge is waiting for you, because this realization pushed them toward a choice they had repeatedly avoided. They began mentally putting together everything they needed to tell you. Not only how they feel, but why they behaved in ways that may have left you confused. And there is one particular moment they desperately want to correct. They remember a time when you needed clarity from them, but instead of giving it, they became distant or said less than they truly meant. You may have walked away from that moment believing their heart had changed. It hadn't. Behind that silence was someone battling the urge to tell you, please don't misunderstand me. I'm scared because this matters. Last night, remembering that moment broke something open inside them. They realized you deserved the truth then, and you deserve it even more now. That is why the words, "Please watch this now," carry such urgency. They're hoping you understand what they couldn't express before. But there's still one piece missing, because after remembering that painful moment, they made a decision about you that they had never been brave enough to make before. That decision came quietly, but it changed everything inside them. They decided they could no longer keep protecting themselves at the cost of losing you. For so long, they had waited for the perfect moment, some unmistakable sign that you would understand, forgive, or at least listen. Last night, they realized that perfect moment might never arrive. Sometimes you have to speak while your voice is still shaking. Sometimes you have to risk hearing an answer you fear because silence has become even more painful. They pictured you moving farther away emotionally, and something inside them refused to accept that possibility without trying. So they began choosing honesty over control. But there was one question they needed to answer before reaching toward you. If you gave them another chance to speak, what would they finally say first? Surprisingly, it wouldn't begin with, "I miss you." Those words are true, but they aren't enough. What they want to tell you begins with an apology for making you question something that was real. They know there were moments when their behavior didn't match their feelings. Moments when they seemed cold while secretly hoping you would stay. Moments when pride stopped them from admitting they were hurting. Last night, they replayed those contradictions one by one, and suddenly they understood how confusing it must have felt from your side. That realization became deeply emotional because they could finally see your experience instead of only their own fear. Don't skip this, because once they understood that, another memory surfaced, and this one made them realize you had actually given them an opportunity to be honest before. They remembered the exact feeling of that opportunity. You may not have directly asked them to confess everything, but something in your words, your patience, or the way you stayed present gave them an opening. They noticed it. They felt it. And they still backed away. Why? Because admitting what they wanted would have required admitting how much power this connection had over their heart. Last night, they finally stopped pretending that vulnerability was weakness. They understood that hiding had already hurt more than honesty probably ever could. So now their message is becoming clearer. Please watch this now, because there's something I should have told you when I had the chance. Yet what they're preparing to reveal isn't only about the past. Something happened after the two of you became distant, something that made them realize just how impossible replacing your presence would actually be. After the distance grew between you, they tried to return to normal. They filled their days, kept themselves occupied, and acted as though your absence was something they could simply adjust to. But ordinary moments kept exposing the truth. A familiar phrase reminded them of you. A certain song brought back a conversation. Even good news felt strangely incomplete because you weren't the person they could immediately tell. That was when they discovered something they hadn't expected. Missing you wasn't only about romance. They missed the emotional safety they associated with you, the feeling of being understood without having to explain every hidden thought. Last night, those memories came back stronger than usual, and they finally asked themselves why every attempt to move forward somehow kept leading their thoughts back to you. The answer frightened them because it meant their feelings had survived everything they thought would weaken them. Time hadn't erased the connection. Distance hadn't made it meaningless. Instead, those things had stripped away the distractions and forced them to recognize what mattered. They began comparing who they were when you were emotionally close to who they became after pulling away. That comparison was painful. They realized they had been protecting themselves from vulnerability while quietly creating the exact loneliness they feared. And then another thought hit them. What if you had been going through the same confusion while believing they simply didn't care? That possibility brought tears because suddenly they weren't grieving only what happened, they were grieving everything that might have happened differently if they had spoken sooner. That is when their decision became more serious. They stopped thinking about whether reaching out would make them look vulnerable and started thinking about whether remaining silent would become their greatest regret. In their mind, they began speaking directly to you. I should have told you. I should have trusted what was happening between us instead of running from it. But there was one sentence they couldn't finish. Every time they reached it, emotion took over, because those words would reveal exactly what they want from you now. Not what they wanted months ago. Not what fear made them pretend they wanted. What they want today. And before they can say it, they need you to understand one unexpected truth. During the time you thought they were letting you go, they were secretly making a choice that kept you much closer to their heart than you ever realized. That secret choice was simple, but emotionally it meant everything. They refused to completely close the door on you. Even when they told themselves it was time to move forward, some part of them kept preserving a space where your connection still existed. They held on to memories they could have deleted. They remembered details about you they pretended had become unimportant. And whenever they imagined their future, your presence kept appearing in places they hadn't invited it. Last night, they finally stopped calling that coincidence. They understood that somewhere beneath all the fear, they had been hoping life would give them one more opportunity to make things right. But then a harder question surfaced. If that opportunity appeared today, would they actually have the courage to take it? This time, their answer was different. Yes. Not because the fear disappeared, but because losing you without telling the truth suddenly felt worse than being rejected after telling it. They began thinking about what they would say if you were sitting directly in front of them. They wouldn't make excuses. They wouldn't blame timing, circumstances, or misunderstandings. They would tell you that they became overwhelmed by the depth of what they felt and handled it badly. They would admit that some of their silence was pride, some was confusion, and some was fear that you could hurt them simply because you mattered so much. But there is something else they would admit, something they barely allowed themselves to think until last night. Stay with this, because this is where their emotions shifted from regret into a very real intention. They don't only want you to understand the past anymore. They want the possibility of creating something different with you now. That unfinished sentence in their mind finally became clear. If there is still a place for me in your heart, I want to stop running. Those words terrified them, because saying them means surrendering control over what happens next. You could listen. You could hesitate. You could decide too much time has passed. They know that. Yet last night, for the first time, they accepted that your response belongs to you, and honesty belongs to them. That is why, please watch this now, feels less like a request and more like an emotional doorway they are finally willing to open. But before they step through it, there is one last truth they have been afraid to face, because it involves the exact moment they realized they might genuinely lose you. That moment came when they noticed something different about you. Maybe it was the way your energy seemed quieter, the way you stopped reaching as much, or simply the realization that you were no longer standing emotionally where they had left you. For a long time, they assumed there would always be another opportunity. Another conversation. Another opening. But last night, that assumption disappeared. They suddenly understood that your heart has limits too. You can care deeply and still become tired of uncertainty. You can love someone and still decide that protecting your peace matters. That possibility hit them harder than they expected, because for the first time they imagined returning with everything they had been afraid to say, and discovering you were no longer waiting to hear it. That was when the tears came again. Not because they believed they were entitled to another chance, but because they finally understood what hesitation can cost. They remembered the moments when you showed patience. The times you gave them room instead of demanding answers. The subtle ways you tried to understand what they couldn't explain. And suddenly those memories didn't feel ordinary anymore. They felt precious. They began wondering whether you had already reached the point where words alone wouldn't be enough. If they came toward you now, could they prove through consistency what they failed to communicate before? That question stayed with them for hours. And somewhere between regret and fear, they reached another realization: if they speak now, they cannot return with half-truths. They have to tell you everything that truly matters. And there is one truth they have avoided more than all the others. They have imagined what it would feel like to see you genuinely happy without them. They tried telling themselves they could accept it easily, but last night they discovered that thought hurts because it forces them to confront what they could have built with you. Still, they know love cannot be demanded. So what they want now isn't control over your decision. They want one honest opportunity to place the truth in your hands and let you decide what happens next. Please watch this now, their heart keeps saying, because they are finally ready to explain why they became distant when they wanted closeness, why they stayed silent when they had so much to say, and why last night changed them. But there is still one thing they haven't revealed: the specific promise they quietly made to themselves before finally putting their phone down. The promise they made to themselves was this: if another genuine opportunity appears between you, they will not hide behind fear again. They won't pretend they feel less just to protect their pride. They won't leave you decoding silence when honest words could give you clarity. Last night, they finally understood that courage doesn't guarantee the answer they want, it simply means respecting you enough to tell the truth. And strangely, once they made that promise, something inside them became calmer. The tears didn't disappear, but the confusion began to. They knew what they needed to do. Yet one question remained: would you recognize the difference between the person who once pulled away and the person now preparing to come toward you with nothing hidden? That question matters because they know an emotional confession alone cannot repair everything. They've thought about the trust that may have been weakened, the questions you may still carry, and the possibility that you need actions rather than beautiful words. This realization is important. They aren't imagining that one conversation will erase every difficult moment. Instead, they're thinking about consistency, showing up when they say they will, answering instead of disappearing, listening instead of becoming defensive. Last night, they pictured what it would mean to finally give you the clarity they once withheld. And then they remembered something about you that made them